Greetings from the Institute for Religion, Peace, and Justice. My name is Brad Jersak, and today I have with me Wayne Northey. Wayne has been active in the criminal justice arena and a keen promoter of restorative justice since 1974. He was the director of Man-to-Man, Woman-to-Woman, or as we call it, M2W2 here, Restorative Christian Ministries in BC, Canada, for many years until he retired from there in 2014. Since then, he's continued to write, and beginning in September 2018, he began publishing a series of books titled Justice That Transforms. And so far, 3 of those volumes are complete. I would call them must-reads if you're going to engage with restorative justice. And it's really collections of his writings on restorative justice with more to come, at least 2 more volumes in the work, but I bet that won't be the end of it. I first met Wayne in the early 1990s when I was preparing to join a group to go with the Mennonite Central Committee as observers to Haiti and Jamaica. And part of our preparation was to have Wayne come in and share his insights with us. And I found that absolutely transformative to my own views of restorative justice. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome my friend Wayne Northey.
Thank you, Brad. Nice to join. Thank you.
Glad to have you. It's a privilege. So let's just jump right in. Wayne, in your writings and the way you teach, you claim that the modern nation state is actually closer in its origins to what was dramatized by Marlon Brando in his character in The Godfather. That is to say, the modern Western nation state originated and operates on similar principles to a criminal protection racket. You cite historian and theologian William Kavanaugh, who said this: the main difference between Uncle Sam and The Godfather is that the latter did not enjoy the peace of mind afforded by official government sanction. And so by that, I understand you to mean the state vis-a-vis its external enemies, whatever in the moment flavor that takes, but also in its exercise of population control, that is domestic enemies, or what we call criminals. Is that fair?
Yeah, and maybe to respond to that opening question, one could get at some of that in many ways and could go on for a long time. But I'll try to give about 3 pointers in a kind of a response. It's an obvious truism that criminal law making and enforcement are function not so much of innate universal moral principles, kinds of Kantian moral categorical imperatives, but as the late Norwegian criminologist Niels Christie argues, they are a function of power elites who establish the laws, then enforce them through the agency of a coercive state apparatus, the criminal justice system. In other words, despite otherwise vaunted law school 101 claims of noble origins, British common law, on which our Canadian legal system rests, similarly, the American We the People criminal justice system, are generated by oligarchs on their own behalf, economically, legally, socially, etc., etc. Professor Vern Radekop, drawing on anthropologist René Girard, refers to such systems as societal scapegoat mechanisms by which the select few are prosecuted/persecuted, he says, on behalf of the many. I shall return to that. And by the way, prosecution and persecution have the same etymological root. 2, limiting the response to North America, which I know best, in colonial times and since, when America in 1796 became the first modern democracy, and Canada in turn became one after our Confederation in 1867, neither started out with embrace of anything even close to lawmaking along the lines of universal moral principles and human rights. The legacy, in fact, of this vicious reality has confronted us worldwide with renewed vigor in enormous groundswells of protest ever since the murder of George Floyd. Two of myriad examples are slavery laws from pre-Republic times in the United States, enforced by brutal slave patrols. And by the way, they were significantly the origins of American policing. And the wrongful in Canada would be the wrongful execution of Métis leader Louis Riel, whom outside of Canada probably no one has heard of, but an example there too. So a politician touting law and order, right now Trump say in the States, begs the questions, whose law, what order or orders, and a criminal justice system begs the questions, whose justice, what kind of justice? A great book by Canadian-American activist, author, and filmmaker Astra Taylor gets at this through a very arresting title, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. That book just came out in May of this year. Number three, noted 20th century American sociologist Charles Tilley, in a fascinating chapter of a book called War Making and State Making as Organized Crime, posits a kind of irrefutable maxim. If, he says, protection rackets represent organized crime at its smoothest, then war risking and state making, quintessential protection rackets with the advantage of legitimacy, qualify as our largest examples of organized crime. Drawing mostly on Western European history, he continues, this essay, that chapter in the book, then concerns the place of organized means of violence, protection rackets, in the growth and change of those peculiar forms of government we call national states, relatively centralized, differentiated organizations, the officials of which more or less successfully claim control over the chief concentrated means of violence within a population inhabiting a large contiguous territory. Might want to replay that just to get that rather succinct distillation. Not unrelated, famed psychiatrist Carl Menninger in 1966 wrote a book, The Crime of Punishment. It has stood the test of time, claiming punishment, in this case in the United States, is hugely disproportionately meted out by white elites to lower classes and minorities, and is greater annually, he says, in commission of crimes against prisoners than the sum total of crimes committed by all criminals in prison. That's, of course, not a scientific study that shows that. That's his own surmisings, hence the crime of punishment. Or in another arresting title by an author, Jeffrey Ryman, you can still go order this book, The Rich Get Richer and the Poor Get Prison, Ideology, Class, and Criminal Justice. A powerful read.
Wow. Wow. That resonates and to our instincts, I think. So I want to come back to you personally, Wayne. In reviewing your bio, I note that your university education was in French and German literature, and that was on your way to becoming a high school languages teacher. But then you rerouted and you had a life-changing experience in West Berlin, Germany. And I'm assuming similar to what we read in your novel, Chrysalis Crucible, a must read, by the way. You completed an undergraduate degree, then returned to Canada. You graduated with your master's in theological studies at Regent College here in Vancouver.
Yeah.
All right. So I review that and I go, wait a minute. Nothing in those studies really pointed to a subsequent 40-year career in Canadian criminal justice and its system and your continued involvement since retirement 6 years ago. So, quote, a funny thing must have happened on the way to the forum, as it were. What altered your life course?
Yeah, well, thank you. After completion of seminary studies, I was heading towards mission work with an agency in Bogota, Colombia. But a piece of correspondence, a plane turned back to Vancouver from Seattle due to fog, and a friend on that plane, a story I tell sometimes, saw me begin working instead in 1977 with a brand new 1975 mediation program in Kitchener under Mennonite Central Committee, Ontario. I, in fact, became its second director. No one knew then that the Victim Offender Reconciliation Project, so called at first because it was a very tentative, novel venture in the Canadian criminal justice field, would eventually become the most replicated mediation program in the world. And it became central to the launching of a new, eventually worldwide phenomenon, restorative justice. At Regent College, I had learned the importance of thinking through one's vocation Christianly. In pursuing that in practice, thought, and writing with reference to criminal justice, I quickly discovered that as all roads lead to Rome, so all justice theology, theo, God, logical thought and word about God, leads to the very center of God's heart.
Right. So if we just, in terms of this thinking Christianly, and the connection with justice theology, I want to retrace our steps to the beginning of this discussion. That Western nation building was a function of profound violence. And in that context, you often use these two key phrases, the domination system and scapegoating violence. And I recognize the voices of Walter Wink and Rene Girard there.
Yeah.
So just to unpack those for those listening first, Walter Wink claimed that all Western nation states participate in a domination system. And he called this the very ethos of Western civilization, the domination system. Second, anthropologist Rene Girard, the father of mimetic theory, he taught that the founding moment of all cultures is scapegoating violence. So there we have the domination system and scapegoating violence as the fundamental or foundations of Western culture. So with that in mind, framing it that way, could you share what presented early on in your growing understanding of criminal and restorative justice?
Okay, I will. And I'll come back to Rene Girard again a little bit later as well. When I was first merging into what became the restorative justice field, after having begun almost a half century before visiting prisoners in Ocala Prison in Burnaby, Canada, British Columbia, Canada, while I was at Regent College, there was soon enough an emerging awareness of many problems in contemporary, back then, Canadian criminal justice practices, and by extension, obviously, in Western criminal justice jurisdictions. I'll sketch out a few of them in a moment, but and by the way, not a great deal has changed since, and I'll get into that. A quick word, though, about terminology, because I use it now. There has been in Canada a conscious rejection of the word victim in favor of something like those harmed by crime, thereby putting the emphasis rightly on the perpetrator and removing any sense of culpability of the other. My wife works in an end abuse program that refers to women not as victims of abuse, rather as women in abusive relationships. The difference, though subtle, leaps out. Charles Thornton, a friend incidentally in Washington, D.C., likewise has taught us to no longer use the terms ex-prisoner, ex-con, rather returning citizen. Nomenclature is important. So now back to an answer to some of what you've asked. First, there was initially the problem that those harmed by crime felt they were, in advocate Jerry Armenich's words, the orphans of justice. Several needs had begun to be identified, and of course continue so to the present, that can be summed up in the profound need for those harmed by crime for an experience of what we could call fundamental justice. There was a need somehow to set things right, to regain a sense of power over one's life, to move on. But the Western system of law was for centuries never designed to deliver such. And though much improved across Canada through police victim services and many other initiatives, and in other countries too, criminal justice systems still significantly underserve the needs of those harmed. The system was, and far too often still is, towards a kind of games playing where rules, precedents, and process were all important. Human relationship values at best secondary. American Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, for instance, a century ago, once responded to a friend's admonition to go and do justice with the words, "I don't do justice, I simply play the game according to the rules." But one always has to ask, again, whose justice, whose rules, whose laws, whose orders? And all the essentially human dimensions of Western jurisprudence tended to get squeezed out in favor of rules and gamesmanship. Hugely ironic. The system had no investment in discovering anything like the multi-layered truth of things related to crime. Rather, guilt finding and punishment delivery were its primary preoccupations. Further, generally the professional players, judges, lawyers, police, etc., are bereft, one might say, of any bedside manners, because the entire justice system edifice, from law school to police to court to prison and back again, is, by this standard, still largely, simply put, inhuman. Second, the system was also not working for those doing the harms. In my personal interaction since 1974 with hundreds of those who harm others, that is from nearly 50 years of professional and volunteer work in the prisons, prisoners consistently expressed largely a sense of injustice at the hands of the system. Most, in my experience, admitted their own guilt. Meant to turn this off. They admitted their own guilt, but it was a case of invoking the old adage, two wrongs do not make a right. To repeat, psychiatrist Carl Menninger's 1966 book entitled The Crime of Punishment was a broadly apt statement of their case. The state's duty had been for centuries, as earlier said, to inflict pain at a profoundly impersonal and punitive level. Again, criminologist Niles Christie wrote that Western state law was essentially pain law, concerned primarily with pain delivery, just like milk delivery, thing of the past for everyone, to which his response was dreadful. But the issue went deeper still. Those doing harm were also mystified often by the entire process. Clear perceptions were that unfortunately he, she had been caught, and the eye for an eye model, as mistakenly, by the way, understood from the biblical precept, had made justice predominantly tit for tat, that is, retributive and punitive. Societal vengeance strictly exacted, like Shakespeare's pound of flesh. To begin with, the perpetrator rather needed at minimum to demonstrate accountability for harm done, for which there was simply no mechanism. Then, so much more was needed, such as confession of guilt and expression of remorse, ideally, to those harmed, with a genuine prospect of reintegration into society for both those harmed and those harmed, often sidelined, and those doing the harm. Third, the impacted community needed to take back its own conflict and justice doing, not vigilante justice, and worse, like the Proud Boys we've been hearing of, rather initiatives designed to help society heal. Communities were traditionally often left, excuse me, with very little sense of safety or reassurance in the wake of crime. As well, as Niles Christie puts it, conflict or doing justice in Western criminal law long since had been stolen from the community. Crime was defined in terms of law breaking, a breach of rules and regulations set by the state, not in terms of a break in relationships between persons, real persons, healing of which the community was often best equipped to take at least some significant initiative. Then finally, the system was not working vis-a-vis its many attempted prison reforms. Soon after, the Philadelphia Walnut Street Jail was repurposed as the first ever penitentiary doing penance. In 1790, the deep psychic harm done to its cloistered occupants became everywhere evident. Despite this, the penitentiary model quickly also became the widest used tool of crime control in the world. In the United States, as detailed by Niles Christie, crime control became a pervasive industry whose human products were consequently deeply psychologically scarred. The classic book on this was by postmodernist Michel Foucault, first published in French in 1975, in English that same year as Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison.
Okay, well, that rings so many bells, but I think at this point in the interview, it's my time to play devil's advocate. And I struggle to say that because that might really be being the devil's advocate. But let me give a counterpoint and see how you respond. All right, what's reality? We all live in nation states now. Lots of crimes get committed. What do you think the state should do instead of deploying retribution in response to crime through its criminal justice system, or perhaps more accurately, its penal system, right? Where it's boiled down to punishment. I know enough about you that your solution is not simply to shut down all prisons and cancel all police forces. So yes. You're a more nuanced thinker than that. So talk to me about solutions. What's the alternative path ahead if we could take one?
Yeah. Well, thanks. Well, certainly, obviously, one duty of the state I can agree with fully, and who doesn't, I guess, would be the question, except maybe extreme anarchists, is protection of its citizens from harm. And as far as it goes, that's a good protection bracket for the state to be in, I think almost everyone would say. Obviously, however, even there, the Godfather's response is the opposite of the ideal. But I'm going to take a long route to respond, Brad. I'll give a little bit of history, and then I'm going to get back to René Girard and a bit of his mimetic theory in terms of anthropology a bit. So there has been a long-standing dialectic between state and community justice stretching back to the Near East in ancient times. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi of about 1754 BC, for instance, codified much community justice, though it still kind of came out smelling of state law. Biblical justice, though, tended to transform even state law into community justice with a unique emphasis upon covenant. A lot about covenant theology, we know. It was what Martin Luther King Jr. understood when he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. At its high point, biblical justice and peace kiss each other according to Psalm 85:10. Listen to the passage up to verse 12 according to the Voice with the transliterated Hebrew added. Unfailing love and truth have met on their way. Righteousness, tzedek, and peace have kissed one another. Truth will spring from the earth like a plant, and justice, tzedek, will look down from the sky. Yes, the eternal will plant goodness in the earth, and our land will yield great abundance. A similar note is struck in Isaiah 32, verses 15 to 18. So it will be until God pours out the Spirit from up above, and the land comes alive again. Desert to fertile field to forest. Then justice, tzedek, and truth will settle in the desert places, and righteousness, tzedek, will infuse the fertile land. Then righteousness, tzedek, will yield peace, and the quiet and confidence that attend righteousness, tzedek, will be present forever. My people's homes and hometowns will be filled with peace. They'll relax, safe and secure. Now, without doing a Hebrew word study, this kind of justice that Dutch criminologist Herman Bianchi in his book Justice as Sanctuary toward a new system of crime control dubbed Tzedakah justice, with a greater antiquity than the Aristotelian give everyone his due, that was also rife, by the way, with inequities, constitutes this system, alternative system, constitutes a central biblical Hebrew concept. For instance, the term alone of tzedakah occurs 157 times throughout the Hebrew Bible, as does the related tzedek, which you heard. It's found 119 times, and the adjective tzedek appears 206 times. So there's a lot about that kind of justice. For Bianchi, the power of this idea is not based upon a religious notion of revelation from God so much as in his case, upon its ability to sensitize us and point to another way of doing humanitarian justice. A provisional definition by Bianchi in that book mentioned on tzedakah, in the chapter on tzedakah, proves to be his final. Not, he says, an intention, but the incessant diligence to make people experience the genuine substantiation of confirmed truth, rights, and duties, and the eventual release from guilt within a system of eunomic, healing, reintegrative, it means, law, eunomic, healing, reintegrative law. Whatever else, this kind of justice is non-punitive and non-retributive. Bianchi directly contrasts, excuse me, the tzedakah model with the conventional justice model. Give everyone his due in the latter leaves the status quo unchallenged, rank inequality the norm. Whereas in tzedakah, there is a constant dynamic of change and equal treatment. Intention is paramount in the retributive system, results a genuine experience of healing justice vital in the other. A tree is recognized by its fruits, as we learn in Matthew's gospel from Jesus. That is the Judeo-Christian wisdom about the primacy of the outcome of justice. Bianchi stated elsewhere that though the intention of prison reformers in initiating the American penitentiary experiment in 1790 was to better the lot of criminals, in fact, the results, as earlier said, were ever afterwards disastrous, a fact so thoroughly documented as not to need repetition. Moving on. In the 11th to 13th centuries in Europe, as one historian explains, the state began to replace the individual as the guiding force behind prosecutions, with the eventual appearance of the state as the sole source of prosecutorial energy. The criminal act could no longer be viewed as an attack by one person on another. It was now an offense committed against society at large. Regina versus the individual in British common law, which Canada and the British Commonwealth inherited, we the people of whatever state versus the individual in the US, gradually became the new state-centered justice system. I know, for instance, of a rape victim who fantasizes, this is awful, about calling the Queen, Regina, on the anniversary of the rape to ask how the Queen is doing.
Wow.
The elements of this enduring move to state law in Western jurisprudence, this stealing justice making from the community, were a few. One, the separation of criminal and civil wrongs. Two, the assumption of the centrality of the state, thus moving all criminality to the public realm. Three, the assumption of harsh punishment as normative, that is, pain delivery as a distinguishing mark of criminal law. And four, a move to formal rationalism and codification of law, displacing informal relationship-oriented custom law. In short, the developing criminal justice system in the West over the past millennium lost an earlier peacemaking orientation to crime. In its place became a dominant, what the Nixon administration in the 20th century declared to be a war on crime. And prison populations have exploded in the United States ever since, in many other parts of the world too. Today, with over 2.3 million incarcerated in the US, it is the highest per capita prison population in the world. Land of the free, indeed. Already alluded to, Niles Christie authored Crime Control as Industry Towards Gulag's Western Style, with a question mark, which looked at the American system. When first published in 1994, there was indeed a question mark at the end after the word style. In subsequent editions, the question mark was removed. The industrialization of punishment had arrived, indeed exploded, claimed Christie. And he, Christie, like Carl Menninger in The Crime of Punishment, insisted that the true and present danger, now get this, in Western society were not the criminals in their confines, rather the crime control industry itself, that in so many ways holds entire societies hostage behind prison walls of fear and neglect, imitators indeed of the very darkest urges of our human condition. The United States, for instance, has roughly 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. In 1975, the combined state and federal prison population of the United States was 300,000 men and women. By 2000, 31 years later, right, in 3 decades, it had exploded to 2.3 million and has remained there more or less since. In other words, as social critic Ivan Illich warned, the Western state, supremely modeled in the United States to the world, had become in turn a state modeled after the notorious Russian Gulag. The 3rd edition of Christie's book was published before September 11, 2001. His forewarnings have been so much more profoundly the case ever since.
Wow. I'm hearing echoes of Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. I'm hearing allusions to Girardian mimetic theory, and on that we do need to go there. But first, could you please situate restorative justice then, intellectually and historically?
Okay, restorative justice emerged in a kind of direct challenge. Last century emerged in a kind of a direct challenge to such developments as sketched out in Western law, in particular as an alternative to decidedly violent and punitive realities. In 1974, to tell a brief story that's been told umpteen times, 2 youths who one night had been drinking and while driving around had been pulled aside by the police and sent home. Later that evening, getting quite drunk, they set out to take out their perceived frustrations on the small community of Elmira, Ontario, Canada, by doing damage to 22 different vehicles, homes, and buildings. Several months later, the youths pleaded guilty to the charges, and the judge ordered a pre-sentence report. 2 Mennonites, whom I know well, one a probation officer who wrote the report, decided to suggest a novel sentencing idea to the judge, ordering offenders first to make it right with their victims. The judge indicated that the notion had lots of merit, but it was simply, to his awareness, and he was right, unprecedented in Western jurisprudence. He made a fateful choice nonetheless when he decided, why not? And put the sentencing over until the youths had met each of the victims who were open to the encounter. Out of that resultant positive experience, and neither of the perpetrators got bloody noses, arose in 1975 the first ever victim offender reconciliation project, VORP, terrible acronym, later to become known widely as Victim Offender Mediation, or simply Mediation Services Project, because it was so tentative initially. It was also generally acknowledged to be the first ever expression of restorative justice in a criminal justice jurisdiction in the Western world. Though other alternatives to Western punitive justice were also stirring. The ensuing model became eventually the most replicated in mediation programs worldwide, as said. There were, however, indigenous community justice procedures stretching back millennia everywhere in the colonized world that had simply been shoved aside or ignored. Such approaches informed hugely developments in Canadian criminal justice, such as circle sentencing, in New Zealand, family group conferencing, etc., etc. The so-called Elmira case, or Kitchener experiment, was then a kind of proverbial shot that echoed around the world. 2 years later, in 1977, I became second director of that first ever restorative justice program under Mennonite Central Committee Ontario that launched me on a wonderful restorative justice journey ever since.
All right. So if I'm hearing you right, the roots of mediation services actually are in a kind of community justice that even predates penal justice or violent notions of justice. So let's say in these First Nation communities, you've got this community justice concern, or in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, the kind of justice you described as kissing mercy, and even where mercy to the victim and the offender is how things are made right, restoring shalom in some sense. So if that's so, then we're really seeing a devolution, a devolving of community justice into violent notions of punishment. And so I'm wondering, like, how did that happen? Where did such violent notions of punishment originate and become the norm in criminal or penal justice, retributive justice, especially in the West? How could we move backwards?
Yeah, and I guess we know that in a way we never move back. We can't move backwards, but we do need to move forward, very much informed by both what failed and also by these much deeper traditions in our Western traditions, and as well, of course, in all kinds of indigenous traditions. So to get back at that, and apologies for this phone, I can't throw it out the window because there's no open window. Anyway, I've discussed already then how the formation of Western criminal justice systems were, above all, protection rackets akin to the mob, only with societal legitimation. When one goes back further, however, and poses the above question generically, even at cultures past and present, as you've raised, and I guess I've raised too, anthropologist René Girard argues that the founding moment of every society known to history is in fact violence. All human societies then employ a scapegoat mechanism in order to contain the violence, in order to restore social cohesion. In Western Christian cultures, this form of scapegoating violence eventually was supportive and spread by a highly retributive, was supported, should I say, and spread by a highly retributive interpretation, and many say wrongly, of St. Anselm's 11th century satisfaction theory of the atonement, which I won't go into. Early in the development of restorative justice in Canada, my friend, Professor Vern Redekop of St. Paul University, Ottawa, Canada, authored a widely received piece, Scapegoats, the Bible, and Criminal Justice, Interacting with René Girard. In it, Redekop posed the question, is it possible that what we call a criminal justice system is really a scapegoat mechanism? He then analyzed Girard's thesis about cultural scapegoat mechanisms found in all historical periods and cultures. He answered the question he posed affirmatively, writing, "It is possible to think of the criminal justice system as one gigantic scapegoat mechanism for society." He explained, when one considers how much crime goes unpunished, and among those, how few result in conviction and prison sentences, it turns out that we in Canada imprison on the order of 3% of criminals. Did you get that? On the order of 3% of criminals. This tiny percentage of offenders who are severely punished can be thought of as a collective scapegoat for society. Those individual criminals who want sensational news coverage can function as scapegoats themselves. The case of Bobby Otway, one of those sensational news stories, was a classic Canadian example. He is also a good friend now. You may read the paper Chaplain Hugh Kierkegaard and I did on my website and in volume 1 of my publication series, Justice That Transforms. It's entitled The Sex Offender as Scapegoat, vigilante violence, and a faith community response. In this context of criminal scapegoating, restorative justice poses perhaps the most troubling yet simple rhetorical question. Why harm people who harm people to teach people that harming people is wrong? The restorative justice vision moves away from a war-making scapegoat mechanism to a peacemaking way of nonviolence in a bid to break definitively with the endless cycles of recurrent scapegoating violence in Western criminal justice. Another good friend, Ruth Morris, who died in 2001, not long after having received the Order of Canada, our highest government honor, was always displeased with the term restorative justice, because for her it was not radical, or did not cut to the justice roots, or did not go far enough. Her cry was always not enough. Her preferred term was transformative justice. The series of my writings being published now, just mentioned, is called Justice That Transforms, in Ruth's honor. Following Ruth's trajectory, Justice That Transforms includes a vigorous, fulsome challenge to what Catholic worker founder Dorothy Day repeatedly dubbed the dirty, rotten system, of which Western criminal justice is a key component. Canadian singer Bruce Coburn's Lovers in a Dangerous Time contains the stunning image over against this. Got a kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. Such a trajectory also encompassed prison abolitionism. The International Conference on Penal Abolition, by COPA, which originally used the word prison in place of penal, had its first conference in 1983 in Toronto, which I attended. It was first organized by Ruth Morris. Several more followed, and I was privileged to attend many. It was from the amazing book by others who attended, Criminology as Peacemaking, published in 1991, that I learned ever after to describe restorative justice at its simplest to be a peacemaking, not a war-making response to crime. So simple. One quite expandable to all brokenness in domestic and international relationships. 2 chapters, for instance, in my book series, in fact, the first volume, are entitled Not Enough and International Restorative Justice, and Is There a Place for Dreaming? Restorative Justice and International State Conflict. They align with Ruth's Release All Prisoners Transformative Justice trajectory.
Wow. Thank you, Wayne. This is, for me, it's been a real reminder of what you taught me many years ago, that penal or retributive, or we may as well call it violent justice, is an oxymoron. And it claims to pay a debt to some abstract society, or maybe the queen, an abstracted queen, or and yet it has served neither perpetrators, nor those harmed by them, nor our communities at all. And I appreciate that you'd consent to this Q&A today, presenting a restorative vision that really reminds us of the Judeo-Christian prophetic tradition of the First Nations heritage that we have for a better way. And much appreciated. Could I just have you do a little wrap up now as we bring this all to a close?
Gladly. And maybe just to point out, which many know probably, that the word penal comes from the Latin poena, P-O-E-N-A, and it simply means pain. And it's back to Niles Christie's idea of pain delivery.
Wow.
So to kind of wrap up, I have used at times the term inclusive justice to capture the deep theology and practice of a peacemaking theory of the atonement which you, Brad, drew together in that wonderful publication, Stricken by God, ? For a millennium, the Judeo-Christian tradition has given the West a legacy of violence in response to crime. It need not have, according to its original trajectory and its central protagonist, Jesus. We need to revisit the powerful dynamic of subversion of all violence in that tradition in order for society to internalize deeply the very human story of inclusive justice, which is our cosmic destiny. Then we need to connect ourselves to it existentially with all the will, energy, and imagination we can muster. And one day, according to the biblical image of the peaceable kingdom, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Transformative, inclusive justice that never excludes, and the promise of the peaceable kingdom are the end game of restorative justice, to which I say resoundingly, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Wayne.
Thanks, Brett.